Good morning, and thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rajiv. So I'm delighted to be here, and I want to talk to you today about this new scientifically emerging field that we're seeing occurring at the moment. And this area, it goes by the name of social cybersecurity. It's concerned with keeping the internet free, open, available, and trustworthy. So I'm going to be describing that, but I'm also going to, while I'm doing that, describe to you a variety of work in this area that is the kind of work that is needed to make this area succeed. So let me start by telling you about this movie, The Black Panther. Now, I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't, it's an awesome movie. In this movie is, about, Marvel, superheroes, etc. And we knew when it was coming out that it was going to evoke, a foray of activity. It was going to have a lot of people putting out what's commonly called fake news stories and so on. So what we wanted to do was to do the first ever tracking of the full diffusion, the creation and diffusion of these fake news stories to see, one, what the diffusion process looked like, what was the half-life, how are these things propagating, etc. And this is the kind of movie that would foment concern because it was viewed by the African American community as a turning point, as very important for their community. And it was also the kind of movie that had a lot of Hollywood hype behind it, so there would be just a lot of people watching it, okay? Now, for the things I'm going to show you, the movie actually was actually come out on February 16th of this year, but it actually, in the way Hollywood always does things, was actually shown in a few select movie theaters the day before. So our story actually begins 2 days before the start of the movie. So when this movie came out, sure enough, there were a whole set of false information, fake news stories that came out. One of those was of the form that you see here on Twitter, which was basically, I'm white, I went to this movie, and I was beaten up. Okay? And they would put pictures in, etc., that were completely, made up pictures, weren't even the same people, etc. Now, this story came out, and it instantly started to skyrocket. However, it was not the only fake news story. There were 3 other stories that came out near the same time. One of those was a satirical story. Another one had to do with how this was really an alt-right movie, and it talked about the movie in that context. And the other one was what's called the fake scene story, where they said, I didn't know this movie was about that. And they would show a picture of the Ku Klux Klan or of, Batman or whatever, these scenes that did not happen in the movie. Now, what I want you to notice about these slides, if you can see my drawings, is that in fact, in 3 of the cases, the fake news, the I got beaten one, the satire, and the one dealing with fake scenes, they came in, they peaked real rapidly, and then they went away. These were not stories that lasted for a long time. Their half-life was like a day and a half, very, very quick. In contrast, the one that was associated with the alt-right, where there was a pre-existing community ready to reinforce the story, actually had a much longer trajectory, lasted much longer, and involved way more retweeting, way more original tweets, way more stuff that went off to other media besides Twitter and so on. Now, what's really interesting here is that in the case of the I Got Beaten story, it came out and it went up and it went down right away, but within a few hours after that story came out, the fake satire story came out. And that satire story, as soon as it came out and started to peak, killed off the fake news, the fake I Got Beaten story. So in this case, it's our first example of a citizen response that actually was able to counter fake news and stop it right at the get-go by simply calling it out, all on Twitter. But what was the fake satire? It was things like this. I went to the movies and I got beaten up. My uncle went and they got beaten up. But the point is, they had a cartoon or a picture from a story. They had SpongeBob SquarePants with a boo-boo, right? They had Two-Face, etc. All of these, which were obviously iconic images, and people realized right away these were fake, and that caused them to stop paying attention to the other. Now, this story, what's interesting about it also is the community behind it. It had always been believed that when fake news spread, it was because there was a group there willing to believe it, okay? And that certainly was the case with the alt-right. In contrast, what you're seeing here is going from the 14th to the 23rd, is you're seeing a set of actors, all of whom eventually spread either the I got beaten up one if they're in red, or the satire version of it if they're in green. And what you're seeing is that at the beginning, there's no connections among those dots. They were not interacting, they were not talking to each other, they were not retweeting or quoting each other. As the fake news story came out, the satirists came out and started to quote those original tweets and then started to make fun of them. So you start to see some connections by the 16th, by the 18th even more, and finally by the 23rd, it's one whole community that is discussing now this fake news story and whether it was an appropriate response on Twitter. So we had a community built. Now this particular story, the Black Panther and the fake news, shows several different things. First, it shows that there are many different kinds of fake news. It's not all just, and none of it, in this case, were incorrect facts, okay? There's very little of this was incorrect facts. Secondly, it shows that there is a community involvement. And thirdly, it shows that if you have an offline group that is associated with the story, ready and primed for it, that the stories last longer. So there's a direct connection between what happens in social media and what happens offline. Now, for the Black Panther, that's kind of fun, right? It's not going to really hurt people usually to make fun of a movie. But fake news goes much further. These are examples centered around disasters. Every time there's a natural disaster involving winds, like major tornadoes, etc., you get the picture on the upper left, which is called the megastorm. It just has re-photoshopped in front of it your thing. It's got the Statue of Liberty, the Eiffel Tower. It'll have your new giant statue of Patel in it if a storm comes around, okay? That's kind of like what it would look like. There's also another one that always comes out, which is the sharks, the flooded sharks. Pick your favorite water body, there's sharks showing up in your subways, whatever. Or the flooded airplanes. Those come out every single disaster. They have an extremely short half-life. They come out, someone says, yeah, we've seen that before, that's fake. And it goes away about a day and a half. However, the more damaging ones are things like the picture of the little boy there, where it says, I went to this Manchester, and my brother was with me, and he's not there now. I can't find him. He's lost. Help me. And that actually engendered a manhunt to find this kid. That picture of that boy is the poster child for autistic children. The child at the time of the Manchester event was not even that young anymore. He was much, much older, like 10 years older. Okay, did not event, and it wasted a lot of resources. There's other ones where people like the one on the right, which says, don't call that number for help that you're always supposed to call for help. Instead, call this other number for help. That's actually a targeting scheme aimed at people to find out where their homes are so they can go in and loot it, find out if there's children left over so they can go and capture them and sell them into human slavery, and so on. So we actually are seeing the use of these kinds of stories during disasters to actually target, to help and support criminal activity. And of course, sometimes these stories lead to have direct physical consequences. One of our favorites is Pizzagate, which is where there were fake news stories out on the internet that Hillary Clinton was using the basement of a pizza store to actually hold demonic rituals and engage in acts of pedophile with a bunch of kids. Okay, this went so crazy that one person got so upset by this, they actually took a gun in and went and started to kill people. Okay, increasing number of crimes are being encouraged through, again, these kinds of stories on social media. And there's other kinds of crimes as well. So for those of you who are interested in pure cybersecurity, one of the things we found is that the more on social media there's abusive or what's called hate speech against a particular country. Like if all of a sudden we start saying, blah, 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 China is bad, or blah, 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 Russia is bad. That disproportionately, when that happens, you start seeing cyber attacks against those countries. So you can actually encourage, from just negative talk on the web, attacks against individuals, or attacks against countries, or attacks against organizations. Insider threat is now becoming increasingly problematic because of the spread of disinformation through the web. So what is social cybersecurity? Well, it's really about a new science. It's about the science that helps you characterize and understand and forecast the cyber-mediated changes in human behavior, social, cultural, and political. And it's also, and this is very critical, it's also about the engineering that you need in order to do this. It's the engineering you need to build a cyber infrastructure for society to persist in its form and to, basically stop all of the bad things from happening in the cyber environment. So it's an operational or science. It's a science that is very much concerned with not just understanding and developing theories about how people do things, developing methods for stopping things, but then operationalizing those, building the engineered tool set that you need or the devices you need to stop it. It lies right at the heart between the areas of computational social science, policy and law, and also media and marketing. All three of those fields have a tremendous footprint in this area, and the way you get good social cybersecurity work is it's right in the intermix. It's just kind of right at the heart, the core of those three things. Because you have to develop the technology, you have to develop the laws that go along with it, and you have to develop an understanding of what people need, want, and will use the system all at the same time for this to work. The field itself has grown dramatically. We actually collected data on all the different papers that had been written in this area. Now, all of these papers had to deal with, the kind of computational social approach to cybersecurity. This meant that pure machine learning papers were not included. This also meant that any of the work on privacy was not included, because those were viewed as other areas. What you can see here is an exponential growth in the field, largely growing, most of the growth being after the advent of Twitter and Facebook. If you look at where the papers are appearing, they're appearing everywhere. There's a lot of books, there's a lot of chapters, but there's 6 major conferences with WWW, ASONAM, and SBP BRIMS among those. Some of these conferences are small, some of them are large, but the point is no one of them dominates. Most people in this area do not know each other. And in fact, when we went and would ask people who work in this area, who else do you know who works in this area? Most people would say, nobody, just me and my students. In point of fact, there's people from a large number of disciplines. Okay, but none of them are publishing in the same place. The disciplines that are most involved in this area at the moment are things such as data mining, social science, communications, computer science, web science, artificial intelligence, and so on. Okay, at the moment, computer science, social science, communication are the dominant 3, but that, is evolving a little bit as new technologies come into being. In terms of the number of people, there's over 11,000 people who have written a paper in this area. Okay, 11,000. That's not just me and my students, okay? But as you can see from this particular picture, most of those people this is showing you the co-authorship, who wrote a paper with whom. And for the most part, most people have written like one paper with a student, or they've written a paper, they have a small little group in their lab who've written papers, those kind of circles, okay? But there's this big central core that actually includes people like myself, Wan Lu, Han Davalkulu, and a few others, who actually have kind of, through this area, been creating a community, okay, that is concerned with this. And this is one of the basic features of the field. So now let's go on and look a little bit more at who's actually on social media and look a little bit about some of the problems, therefore, that this field of social cybersecurity will need to address. Now, we all know that we as individuals are on social media. You know, you may be on 2 or 3 of them. There's also organizations are on it. Most organizations now do not make money unless they also have a Facebook page, a Twitter account, etc. But there's also these things called bots, these automatic processes that do things for you. This includes both bots as well as, which are sometimes referred to as Sybils, as well as cyborgs, which are a people plus bot combination. And then, of course, there's the troll farms, which are a bunch of individuals acting collectively to do things like bots. So most of us are aware that these 3 kinds of actors are actually in social media. What you may not be aware of is the fact that your brain does you a disservice when you read messages in social media. In particular, when you read a message, you do not remember where it came from usually. And in fact, you know, after a few months, you'll even forget not only where you read it, sometimes you'll even forget that you read it and think you made it up, but you don't remember whether, in fact, that message came from a bot, a person, or an organization. So when you tell other people information, you don't always necessarily explain where the information came from. Which means that bots can act as kind of force multipliers. Bots can actually be used because you can quickly generate way more bots than people. They can actually be used to get messages out, to change communities, and to affect things. What we have found now in social media is that these bots are operating at 2 levels. On the one hand, what they're being used for is to affect the conversation. They're being used to affect what people are talking about, what ideas are trending, what is viewed as important news, and so on, spreading fake news, etc. The second way they're operating, though, is by affecting who is talking to whom, what groups are present, who is the leader of a group, and so on. They're actually impacting, if you will, the social network as well as the knowledge network. And we've actually identified at this point 16 different kinds of information maneuvers that have been used in the various social medias. These range from things like bridging 2 groups together, to nuking a group, actually causing a group to break apart, to a variety of ones for dealing with information, such as distracting people from a particular issue by sending out secondary information, to creating excitement in a group by spending additional information that gets them all riled up around a particular issue. So we found these 16 different maneuvers out there. How do they work? Well, the way these bots and everything work on social media, and this is regardless of if this is true for different kinds of technologies, is they do 3 kinds of exploits. The first kind of exploit is aimed at the technology. Those technology exploits are things where they look at the way that the system is built, identify how it does things like prioritize messages, how it keeps people out of the system, how it lets people in, etc. And they will build messages and build groups to take advantages of those features. So for example, in Twitter actually prioritizes messages to you, even though they don't tell you exactly, but they take into account such things as the size of the group, topics the group has talked about before, whether there's a super spreader in the group and if the message is coming from them, okay, the number of your followers, and so on. They take that information, and what the bots are doing is they're utilizing that information about what's done, and they construct groups to get their messages prioritized to the group they want to attack. So one is a technology exploit. So social medias that change their rules every day, okay, are much harder to attack. The second thing that they exploit is the way our brains work. That is, these are of the psychological principles of cognition. Things like confirmation bias. If a group already is acting like they know something, they'll give them additional information like that so that they don't question it, is an example. Hatred of being intimidated. They will use intimidation tactics to actually cause people to back off. But they also exploit a new kind of cognition that is not that talked about if you go into psychology classes. And this is something called social cognition. Each of us, our brains are wired in such a way that we make sense of the world, not just in terms of individual items, but in terms of groups. And we make arguments about the world in terms of groups. These are like these shortcuts in the way our brains work. If we did not have these shortcuts, we could not store most of the information we hold about individuals. This includes things like generalization and stereotyping, are aspects of social cognition. But so are these things called appeals to the generalized others. You know what that means is, it's this anthropological term. That means when you go up and you're making an argument to the people in your group, and you say, look, we should do this because everybody knows that blah, blah, blah is true. That everybody, okay, of everybody knows, if I ask you to articulate who was in it, you would go, everybody, you know. You couldn't specify who exactly was in it, but it was this nebulous group that you appealed to in making your arguments. And what these bots are doing is they're creating the perception that everybody knows, and they're utilizing your own social cognition against you. So what we see is a variety of influence operations going on in social media. This is true for Twitter, it's true for Facebook, it's now true for Reddit. We see it all over the place, that exploit both cognition, social cognition, and the technology. But the way they do it is around these things called topic groups. A topic group is a group of actors, okay, generally people, that are connected on two dimensions. One, they have strong social network ties. If this was Twitter, it would be I'm retweeting you, I'm quoting you, I'm responding to you, I'm replying to you, etc. Okay, so we have ties like that. But they're also tied because of the words they use, okay? The hashtags they use, the content of the things. So the individuals are also tied, both not only because they talk to the same people, but they're talking about the same thing. So you can imagine, right? So you love cricket, so you probably have topic group. I know that actually you do. In India, there's a bunch of topic groups centered around the different cricket teams, for example. There's also a bunch centered around the various government issues. So there's three ideas that you need to keep in mind here. The first is this notion of a super spreader. A super spreader is an actor who basically has a disproportionate ability to get the information out, okay? So individuals who have strong number of followers, who have lots of people who retweet them, whose data goes across multiple media, etc., have this super spreader characteristic. And it's long been known that super spreaders are important for the spread of information, and we have many measures and ways of calculating that. And you know, every time we invent a new media, like if you invented like whatever, create WhatsApp, right? People will come up with yet another measure of how to measure this. But it really gets to this idea of the reach. The second idea is what we call a super friend. Now, a super friend is someone who is engaged in interactions in the social media, but they're two-way interactions. It's like I say something and you respond to me. Okay? I say something to you and you respond to me. It's this reciprocity. And reciprocity turns out to be extremely important, especially when in groups. And super friends have a disproportionate ability to convince people of things and to actually get dialogues and get people engaged in dialogues. The individuals in the Black Panther event who were actually able to build the sarcastic images that shut down the fake news were those were super friends. They actually can get things done. The third idea is this notion of an echo chamber. Now, most people, when they talk about echo chambers, are talking about this nebulous idea that it's a bunch of people concerned with politics who are all only talking on one thing. They're all the conservatives or all the liberals. But that's not good enough for science, okay? So instead, what we're meaning by an echo chamber is something that's very measurable. It's this group of actors that all have very dense interconnection at the social network side and at the knowledge network side. So they're like a topic group, but on steroids. They're the purest form of a topic group. Okay, this particular image is trying to give you graphically what this would mean. So graphically, an echo chamber is that little circle up on top, right? You have an all-to-all communication network, and they're also talking about the same topics. The super spreader, who's Indy, has lots of things going out of him, lots of arrows going out, and the super friend, which is Phryne, has a bunch of arrows going out and back in. Okay? Very different kind of network structures. Now, one of the powers of an echo chamber is that if you're connected to 3 people who are all trying to convince you of something, and they all say the same thing, okay, you're going to be more impacted than if just one of your friends said something. So Indy is disproportionately impacted by that echo chamber because the echo chamber is all telling him the exact same things. And because it's an echo chamber, they're all talking about the exact same thing. So they're getting this kind of extra power behind them. Okay, so echo chambers have this power. Now, in social media, particularly in Twitter, echo chambers are very important because one of the ways that Twitter prioritizes messages is they look for dense pockets of communities. They look for these topic groups. And so when you have an echo chamber, right, it's a super dense pocket, it's like, oh, that's a group, then their messages must be important, and we will prioritize their messages. This is an example of how this was used. This is actually associated with ISIS. The big sphere thing on the left is actually the extremist community centered around ISIS circa 2014. And this particular community is operating in 2 different languages, basically in Arabic, which is the bottom green part, and in English, and in a mixture of English and Arabic, which is the one there on your left, the one on the left, not the one on the right. The other thing you're seeing there, the ones that are in blue, are actually the individuals who were suspended from Twitter because of Anonymous. Okay, they went in and said, we think these are all ISIS members, suspend them. Okay, this in part shows you that Anonymous and Twitter, okay, acting as vigilantes, could not speak Arabic. Okay, it shows you they could only speak English. There's actually, most of those individuals, there's no evidence that they're members of ISIS. Only a few of them was there evidence. But importantly, there's this thing called the Fear Be Known bot. Now, the Fear Be Known bot is actually, I don't know if I can actually get this to work. It's this red circle here, which is this green circle right here, okay? And the Fear Be Known bot is this pure echo chamber. It's actually a whole set of bots that actually and it sends out strings of app mentions. Each bot will send out a message that app mentions every other member of the bot team, okay, and a little bit of a message on top of that. So what happened was the Fear Be Known bot was set up. It started doing its little app mention of each other. That caused Twitter to say, ooh, there's this group here, okay, we better start paying attention to it. Then this bot started retweeting messages from this super spreader in this group, who is this imam. The imam didn't have to know anything about what was going on, okay? But they started retweeting it. But that imam was the super spreader. And Twitter says, oh, that person's really important. Their message is going out to lots of people. They have lots of followers. This group, since groups are important, is now tweeting that guy's message. Therefore, I am going to have anything this group says also prioritized and suggested to this big blue group here to listen to. Okay, now all of a sudden that whole group was starting to get messages, suggested to them, and people suggested them from this Fear Be Known bot. Then some of those individuals started following the bot, at which point what the bot did was it started tweeting about this. It started sending out messages to go to this particular site to give money for the children of Syria, which, as far as we can tell, was a money laundering site for ISIS. So this is how bots can act and manipulate things, and they do it through these principles I just talked to you about of super spreaders and so on. Now, this is from the US 2016 elections. This is some data that Twitter recently released that simply shows you who was talking to whom, who was mentioning whom during the election. This is one where they were saying that here was the Russia's impact. What we find with our thing is that in that particular network, almost 1/3 of the actors appear to be bots. Most estimates have placed the number of bots as anywhere from 2% to 10%. However, in association with elections, not just the US, but also the Swedish elections and so on, that number has escalated as high as 50% of the people who are spending, of the actors who are tweeting about politics. Okay. This is what that network looks like. We actually went through, and for all the accounts that were still active, we actually pulled in further information about them and found those bots. Many of those bots are still active, but they are all focused around various topic groups. This is a group focused around the alt-right. This is a group focused around the Black Lives Matter group. There's another, this is just the pure, We Love Russia group, and so on. Each of those groups has bots associated with it, and each of the times what those bots are doing is provoking that group to get more and more excited, trying to segment that group off from groups that might make them less, vitriolic and less upset, and link the groups together that they feel could make them more vitriolic, such as the Southern Baptist women and the alt-right. They link them together so that the Southern Baptist women would vote the same way as the alt-right. Okay, was part of their activity here. Now, here's an information strategy we've seen used by Russia. This is a standard destabilization strategy. We've now seen it in hundreds of cases. What they do is they find two competing groups. Think of it as pro-gun control, anti-gun control, or whatever your favorite issue is. They'll find the two groups. They will place bots in both of those groups. Then they will send out they will build connections to those bots. They will build connections among the actors so they become closer and closer to echo chambers, okay? Then what they do is they start sending out messages in each of those groups that excite the groups along whatever their political difference is. And because they're closer to echo chambers, that excitement starts going very rapidly. Because if you're a human group and you become an echo chamber, what happens is that when your emotions get excited, your emotions will fire the entire group up, and the group itself will start closing down to outside information. We'll also start reducing the language that it's using, so it'll actually go from like educated languages down to like 4th grade level reading languages. The word variation will differ, emotions will skyrocket, and if the group has an offline analog, it will actually be more excited toward violence. So the Russians came in, they put bots in both of these groups, they get the groups more and more excited, which drives the groups apart. Okay, now we saw that happening in the elections, that also happened in Brexit, it happened in the German elections, it's happened in the Swedish elections. Here's an example where it happened just earlier this year with respect to NATO. What they did was they went in, and this was focused in Germany, is that some of the members of NATO in Germany were sending out a message saying, hey, we're going to be in 3 NATO exercises this year. Bang the drums, this is great, really very cool. Now, this was the most retweeted, re-mentioned, Facebooked, whatever message, right? And so the people who are part of NATO said, oh man, people know us and love us. But if you actually looked at it carefully, it was actually being retweeted and re-mentioned not by members of NATO, but by the Russians. The Russians were actively sending this message out to excite that group and make that group more of an echo chamber. Meanwhile, RT was sending out another message that said, look, Germany's going to be in NATO this year, but they really can't afford to be there. They're not going to be well equipped because they're not going to have the right tanks, etc., because NATO just costs too much. So the members of Germany who normally are, every country has people who like and don't like NATO. The ones who didn't like NATO were like, yeah, you're right, it is costing too much. And we're going to look stupid anyway, why should we go? And then that started being retweeted by that group, so it excited that group. So now they had this divide and conquer scheme, split the two groups apart, and you got these forces riled up on both sides in Germany, right, that were basically going, go for NATO, don't go for NATO. And you had fights over this, okay? And you see this now happening, like I said, everywhere. this is an example of an intimidation tactic. It's a different one. This one, we have this young lady who is actually a freelance newspaper reporter who's just trying to write out stories about what's happening in Yemen. Now, in this case, what the things we're doing is the bots is that all of a sudden her account went from a few followers to thousands of followers, like really, really quickly. Now, when things like that happen, you know there's probably going to be a lot of bots attached. There were in this case, but these bots were really, really nasty. Now, I'm not showing you most of them, okay? Like there's thousands of these. And I'm specifically not showing you the ones that have pornographic images and, extremely, extremely filthy kind of stuff, okay? But they were trying to intimidate her by putting this like junk on her website. And in fact, there were so many so fast that at first she tried to go to Twitter and get them shut down, but then realized that they were coming on so many and so fast that the amount of time it would take her to get every one of them stopped by Twitter meant that she would not be writing a single news article. So she was like, no, I want to get the news out instead. But that was what these intimidation tactics are trying to do. In some cases where social media bans you because your followers are nasty, which they have done, this kind of intimidation could have gotten her kicked off. But this was Twitter, and Twitter doesn't do that. Okay, this is what the network of bots behind her looked like. What was interesting about these set of bots is that a lot of these were anti-Saudi bots. Other ones were pro-Saudi bots. And we actually thought we were seeing a bot war between Saudi bots and Russian bots, all spinning off from the bots that were following her account. And when they were anti-Saudi, they were actually coming out of Russia, and they were actually talking about all the things they thought the Saudis were doing wrong. Now, the next thing I want to point out is that bots have also been used to get people to do things, like to take part in politics or in protests. This is an example that was done that we found in Nigeria, where they actually had bots producing 1.7 billion tweets, okay, in Nigeria, to excite the people to go out and engage in protests. And in fact, the protesters who went out had interaction with these bots. They thought they were some of their friends, because some of these bots, what they did was they were actually tweeting from other people's accounts. It turns out you can actually buy a service that says, we reserve the right to tweet from your account. And if that clause is in there, your tweets will go out from it, but when you're not watching, tweets from that account, from whoever owns that account, will also go out through there, looking like it was you. And that was one of the tactics they used here. Okay, this is the Swedish elections. Swedish 2018 elections, there were many, many different outlets that were spreading disinformation. It was known as a complete disinformation election because there were just so much stuff coming out that wasn't true at all. The Swedish Defense Research Agency identified 1,200 Twitter bots that were spreading disinformation itself. We think the number was probably about 10 times that. This is what it looked like in terms of the percentage of people talking about the elections on a particular day. The total height there is the total number of people who were tweeting. You can see, like with any of these events, it starts low and it goes up, then it goes down, right? You always get excitement during events, in this case during the election. The darker blue is the fraction of that are bots, okay? Now, in most cases, if this hadn't been Sweden and this hadn't been bots, whatever, the number of bots would be around 5 to 6%, right? If you just set up your own account for a particular cricket team, there's probably going to be about 5 to 6% bots. In this case, the number of bots sometimes got up to 50%, okay? Between 20 and 50%. So it was very, very inundating. Now, some of these accounts are quite interesting. For example, this is the Janusz account. It was the number one most influential account during that particular election. This was a Czech-born Swedish journalist who was criticized for spreading Russian propaganda. Her Twitter account basically averaged about 62 tweets a day, which meant there was bot assistance, which is very common. It's even, if you buy it through Twitter, it's fine to do, okay? And this account, though, is mentioned by this Matteo Salvini, an Italian politician, and it's also the second highest mentioned by Ari Fund. This particular account was supported by and accentuated by lots of bots, including the Seedful bot. This one was then led, and one of the things that propagated from that particular account was a disinformation maneuver that attempted to bridge the Christian and the alt-right communities within Sweden prior to the election. They were trying to convince those two groups that their opinions were aligned and that they should vote in the same way. And they did this by basically tweeting into the Christian tweeters alt-right messages and getting them prioritized to them. They tweeted into the alt-right messages from the Christian one and got theirs prioritized into them. And they actually had enough people who bought into these accounts that had allowed for the owner of the account to tweet from the account for them, that people that were like part of the Christian group thought the messages was like, oh, this is coming from my friend Janie or my friend George or whatever. And in fact, the message was not. They were coming from an alt-right supported bot. But because they thought it was from their friend, they thought, well, I didn't know we believe that alt-right stuff. I guess we do. They appealed in that case again to the generalized other. This is the US elections this year. What this is simply showing you on the left is the by race, meaning there's a Republican versus a Democrat or Republican versus other, whatever, going on. It simply shows you, are there more bots that are following the Democratic candidate, then it's blue, or following the Republican candidate, then it's red. If it's purple, it means their bots are kind of equally following both sets of candidates. And what you see there is there's some states where it's primarily they're following Democrats, other ones primarily following Republicans. And in Texas, good old Texas, where the most exciting race is going on, they're actually following both sides. Interesting thing, though, it's not just bots following and causing trouble and promoting the views and trying to counter the views of the various candidates. You also have the senators and the members of the Congress are actually themselves friending some of these bots. Okay, and when they friend a bot, what they're doing is they're prioritizing the messages by that bot. So on the right, what you're saying is by state, whether the Democrats senator is more friending the bot, or then it's blue. If it's a Republican senator more friending it, then it's red. And if they're both doing it equally, it's purple. And what you can see here is that, for example, in Texas, it's the Republican Senate that is friending senator that's running for office is actually friending the bots more and using that bot as a way of getting their message out. So this is just part of the new way politics is done, is by supporting and friending bots rather than people. They're your new constituency. So bots have this strong ability to manipulate things in cyberspace. Okay, they exploit your social cognition. That is your way of thinking about groups and others. This is really important. Our simulation models have actually shown that the ability to exploit social cognition can actually have a multiplicative effect on on the spread of a message. So it doesn't just make it go further, it makes it go much exponentially faster. They also manipulate the apparent generalized other opinion, making people think that the group as a whole does it. And that means they're affecting the social influence and affecting groups to do half their work for them. They also manipulate the popularity of topics and can affect what information is trending. They can also, and we've seen many examples of this in a variety of ways. Okay. So some of the challenges that people are facing to get around these are things like the data, right? The data is not free and it's not open. Most people can't get the data. If you want full data, you have to buy it, and most researchers don't have that kind of money. When you do get data, if you get it from the APIs of the various tools, if you can get it or if you can scrape it, it's only a sample, and there's biases in it, and what those biases are usually not well known. So for example, on Twitter, when you go and put in a set of keywords to get information, you're more likely to get tweets from the beginning of an hour than spread evenly throughout the hour. Okay, how is that affecting your results? The data is also not necessarily preserved. Most of these social media will suspend accounts, and when they do that, they and you are supposed to get rid of all the old data that was associated with that suspended account. The data is also not shareable. I cannot share with you any of the data that I've collected on Twitter. You're not supposed to share with me, and there's very strong rules on when you can and can't share it. This means we're doing science under very crippling conditions. The data projection is also time variant. It will vary by time period what you can get, and the policies for what you can collect, how you can harvest it, whether you can store it, whether you can share it, are out of whack with each other. So the National Science Foundation or your government may require you to share data that you collect for scientific use, but if that data is from a social media, you're not supposed to. That's what I mean by out of alignment. Okay. Right now, it's kind of like the Wild West on the internet, right? You have lawmakers trying to ban usage of various sorts. You have companies acting in knee-jerk reactions to events, such as when YouTube stopped all videos that had to do with guns after one shooting incident, and then they realized that wasn't going to work, and they put them back up. You have vigilante groups like Anonymous operating and so on. So it's just like a crazy environment in which people are trying to do science because it's so important to understand this media, to understand the human conditions. And it's not clear what things will help, whether to make this work. Right now, we do know that what doesn't work. For example, banning certain people from one media just moves them to another media or to the dark web. Proliferations of patterns and policies across proliferation of platforms is occurring, and as you get more and more platforms, Twitter, Reddit, etc., you get more inconsistent policies and people skidding between them to avoid bad things. In fact, that's one of the way blockchain and so on is making money. You also have key problems in doing this area. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, I can solve this problem for you. Let's just build in a lot of machine learning tools and they'll solve the problem. Like you're talking about fake news, I'm just going to, and I can't tell you how many people I have come in and tell me this. We will solve the problem because we will build a tool that will detect fake news. And then once it's detected, we can just ban it, or we will detect a bot and we'll just ban it. This is a solvable problem. Okay? Well, it turns out that's not true. First, it's not true because the feature set extraction is really hard in this area. It's also not true because training sets really don't exist for most of the things we're talking about, and those that do exist are very limited to only a single language or a single point in time. Developing new training sets is extremely hard, especially when you need tens of thousands of instances. And you have to pay to get iterator reliability on them anyway. You also have problems because these machine learning models are trying to generate a generalized model, but they rarely take into account context well. They all assume stationarity, that tomorrow is like today, but in point of fact, in social media, tomorrow is going to be different. It's going to be different because there's new technologies coming out every minute, and within 5 years, you're going to have these technologies that are going to be able to look like you, sound like you, say things you never said, as we go more and more to video things. So we're going to get lying through voices and people. You get bias in data collection itself as a problem, and of course, you can't explain most of these tools to the public. So let me give you an example of a couple of these that are really egregious. The time to create training sets, okay? First off, you need multiple people, you need inter-rater agreement, you need to have, you have a significant size of data, et cetera. All these good things make for a good training set. So let's imagine that I wanted to create one for bots. There are bot training sets out there. However, the kind of bots that these training sets are good for are the kinds of bots that almost don't occur anymore. They're bots like that simply acted by tweeting the same message out an extremely high number of times, or from a large number of locations, or because they had a large strings of app mentions, or and they had a set of minor things like this that was true about them, and their language did not look like a native language. In point of fact, the new bots are more like random strings. They are tweeting much more in normal human language. They're intermixed with cyborgs and so on. none of the old training sets find you the new bots. Okay, Botometer finds maybe 5% of the bots that are out there. Another example is a generalized model and contextualized application. Most of the models out there don't understand context. So imagine things like, was Churchill a hero or a war criminal? It's a different opinion depending on where you sat. Okay, was Manning, who released all the secrets from the NSA to over the internet, was he an insider threat, or was he really just a whistleblower? Again, context matters. So machine learning algorithms, however, don't really know about context. All they know is about the training set. So they are often applied in contexts that are totally different, where the rules are totally different, the policies are different, and so they create solutions that are bad, right? Just like this poor kid who goes in, hey, Santa, I want a Christmas present. It's like, sorry, our machine learning algorithm says you're getting cold this year. Completely out of context. No parent would have said that. Okay, and then finally, they don't have good explanation, right? Most of the tool, and I do admit, lots of people are working on making them better explanation, which will help, but currently, these tools do not provide explanations of why you're getting the result you're getting, which means policymakers cannot use them. And this is a particular space where we really need the policy to change at the same time the technology is. So, social cybersecurity, like I said, it's an emerging scientific and engineering area. It is highly, highly interdisciplinary to the point that it should actually lead to new transdisciplinary research. It's going to require new research in things like bias estimation, in things like reduction, how to do reduction in data, new sparsification techniques, because even with the best computers we have now, we can't deal with the kind of data we're getting. Movement of actors and ideas between platforms is something that is not even close to understood well. Lots of types of disinformation inoculation for groups. How can you make your group more resilient so they don't fall prey to the false information things? And lots of things on triangulation. So there's a lot of research that is actually needed in this area, and the research that's needed will require a very strong data science skills, very strong social science skills, and very strong policy analysis skills. Most likely it will be done by teams. Key areas that have been discovered and by the people have talked right now in a variety of forums as being important are in social cyber forensics, go out and find the bad guys, right? Information maneuvers, that is which is mostly what I've talked about today. Intent identification. Just because someone sends a message, what were they trying to do? Where is this relevant? Well, I just told you how at the beginning, how satire was used to shut down the Black Panther fake news stories about being beaten up. What we're now seeing happening, though, is these social media messages that are going out that are like trying to say that something bad occurred or whatever, and when they're called on the carpet about it, they say, oh, it was just satire, I meant it to be a joke. So they're hiding behind satire. And so that's why intent identification is important. Anything on information diffusion and image diffusion, effectiveness of the information campaign, how do you measure that? How do you mitigate the effects? And of course, governance. What policies do you need? The high rate of change in the data, the high rate of change in the new information platforms, okay? There's new one coming out every day, right? A lot of these are coming out of Africa because it's a cottage industry that actually supports the villages there to develop new information platforms, new social media platforms. The global flow of information across, and so on. Those things are changing, almost second by second. It's very, very difficult to keep up. But at the same time, there's emerging technical policy and economic solutions, okay, that will impact these, right? Every time a lawmaker puts up a new law about what data you need to keep private, okay, it impacts what science you can do and how these social media groups respond. There's also leading to a social political climate that is demanding you to make your decisions faster and with less data. In other words, if you're trying to work in this very, very applied field and you want to help the lawmaker understand what's going on, they want to know yesterday what you won't be able to find out till 3 days from now. And saying, well, it's going to take me 3 days, or if you're an academic, it's going to take me 3 years, is not a good answer anymore. And so we need new science to be able to respond faster. So in this area, keep this in mind. Social cybersecurity, it's really going to have to make us rethink the way we do science. It's going to require, because of the unprecedented speed that we're going to need in adapting how we do science, in translating theory to operation, and in transitioning tools to those that need them. Thank you.